At 5:42 in the morning, the skies over Florida ignited, not from lightning, not from bombs, but from a single missile launched out of desperation and fear. Within seconds, Tampa was erased from the map, and as a stunned President Kennedy sat silent, the world spiraled into chaos. Cities vanished, oceans boiled, and generals kept asking each other one quiet question: what now? But 30 years later, a weak radio signal whispered from under the rubble of Florida, and what the rescuers found there will haunt you more than the war itself. But let's start from the beginning. It was supposed to end in a handshake, a sigh of relief, a quiet step back from the edge of annihilation. President John F. Kennedy sat alone in the Oval Office at 2:47 a.m., the lamps casting long shadows across the floor, while outside, Washington slept with clenched fists. The leather on the resolute desk was worn from days of nervous hands. The air smelled of cold coffee and fear. A newly decoded message from Moscow had just arrived. Typed in Cyrillic and translated line by line, it was laced with philosophical restraint and poetic caution. One line repeated in Kennedy's mind like a hymn: "We and you ought not to pull on the ends of the rope in which you have tied the knot of war." The room held its breath. Maybe Khrushchev was blinking. Maybe reason had won. But 500 miles south, another man refused to blink. Fidel Castro, pacing barefoot across a tiled Havana floor, had just received intelligence that chilled him to the bone. Khrushchev's inner circle was considering a compromise, removing missiles from Cuba in exchange for peace. To Castro, it smelled of betrayal. He had opened his island to Soviet warheads, risked everything, and now he was to be abandoned like a pawn? That night, he drafted the letter that would change the world. His hands shook with fury as he scribbled in Spanish and had it translated to Russian immediately. If the imperialists invade, then the Soviet Union must launch a nuclear first strike. He didn't just urge retaliation. He begged for it, demanded it. His tone was fatalistic, almost messianic. The letter reached Moscow in the early hours of October 27th. Nikita Khrushchev read it with disbelief. Was his Cuban ally out of his mind? Was this suicidal passion or a trap? But then, before he could draft a response, came the news. An American U-2 reconnaissance plane had been shot down over Cuba. Pilot, Major Robert Anderson. Status confirmed KIA. Inside the Pentagon, silence cracked into shouting. General Curtis LeMay pounded the table. "This is war," he barked. "No more games, no more messages. Flatten the island." Secretary of Defense McNamara countered with a plea for delay. Others suggested a direct call to Moscow. But things were already in motion beyond words. At 3:19 a.m., a sonar signal intended to delay a U.S. destroyer's intercept near the quarantine line was garbled in the Sargasso Sea, distorted by electrical interference, worsened by misinterpretation. Soviet commanders at the San Cristobal launch facility were already on high alert. The garbled transmission was read as, "Prepare for immediate amphibious assault." At 5:42 a.m., 3 R-12 missiles lifted from the Cuban soil with a roar that shook the palm trees into a frenzy. One detonated midair, one veered east and fell into the ocean. The third stayed true. 12 minutes later, it hit Tampa. Firestorms consumed everything within a 3-mile radius. The stadium, the hospitals, schools, churches. The blast wave shattered windows in Orlando. Radiation clouds spiraled upward as rescue crews were vaporized in their first moments on scene. Kennedy was rushed underground. The words on his lips were not rage or command. They were, "God help us." For the first time in its history, America had suffered a nuclear attack on its soil. The dead numbered in the hundreds of thousands. The injured cried through mouths full of ash. The sky dimmed. The silence afterward was not peace. It was shock, and the world, the whole fragile world, stood still. In the bunker below the White House, where thick concrete muffled the screams of a dying nation, Vice President Lyndon B. Johnson sat motionless. His tie was loosened. His hands trembled, not from age or shock, but from the realization that history had just pivoted into nightmare. President Kennedy stood across the room like a statue carved from exhaustion. For 42 minutes he had said nothing, not after the Tampa crater report, not after the infrared satellite confirmed 3 mushroom clouds where a city once breathed, not even when General Lemnitzer placed a red folder in front of him labeled Strike Protocol, November. Every breath in the room waited for his decision. Then, in a whisper that seemed to echo across the marble walls of history, Kennedy said, Delta 6, Strike Protocol, November. No emotion, no fury, just resignation. The command was relayed to Vandenberg Air Force Base in California. The Titan II silos hissed open. Warning klaxons howled across desert plateaus. At 7:02 a.m., 3 massive warheads ascended into a pale sky, dragging the fate of the world behind them. Each missile carried over 9 megatons of death. Their targets were chosen not for military value, but for symmetry. Irkutsk, Novosibirsk, Omsk, 3 beating hearts of Soviet Siberia. 16 minutes later, satellite feeds went black over Asia. Sensors on the international seismographic grid registered pulses greater than Krakatoa. From the Himalayas to the Pacific Rim, the Earth groaned. The Soviet response was both expected and unimaginably swift. 5 SS-4s rose from hidden installations in Belarus and Ukraine. Their destinations, the eastern seaboard of the United States. The targeting systems, once calibrated to hit airfields and silos, were overwritten manually. The orders were brutal. Strike the cities. Boston was erased in silence. The blast consumed Fenway Park mid-game, where a crowd had gathered in denial to wait it out. Philadelphia was turned into glass. The Liberty Bell cracked into vapor. In Washington, a single warhead detonated over Arlington Cemetery, as if mocking the dead before adding millions more. Kennedy, already aboard Angel, the nuclear command aircraft, watched it all unfold through a screen the size of a dinner plate. Cities blinked out. Communications shattered. Emergency lines went from static to silence. His voice barely rose above the drone of the engines. "Is this it? Is this the fire next time?" Meanwhile, alliances dissolved into hysteria. France, seeing Soviet launches on radar but receiving no explanation, believed Paris was next. Within hours, Mirage bombers dropped 4 warheads on Moscow, St. Petersburg, and Gorky. The Kremlin never had a chance. China, misreading French launches as American betrayal, struck out at India. Centuries of conflict condensed into one fiery moment. And Britain, its prime minister lost in a bunker beneath Birmingham, failed to coordinate with NATO command. A pre-programmed failsafe kicked in. At 11:14 p.m. London time, Leningrad was obliterated by a Polaris submarine stationed off the Norwegian coast. The dominoes fell faster than the world could count. By the end of day 2, over 1 billion people were dead or dying. And still, inside the nerve center of Cheyenne Mountain in Colorado, generals spoke in clinical tones about options, as if Option Bravo or Option Sierra might somehow deliver clarity to a world now wrapped in fire. The word survivors was never uttered, because deep down, everyone understood. There wouldn't be any. Not after this. By mid-November, nuclear clouds had sealed the sky in iron. A global temperature drop of 12 degrees Celsius was recorded. Crops failed in Mexico, rainfall blackened over Spain, and in what used to be Kansas, a boy named Eli tried to grow beans under a heat lamp he powered with a salvaged battery. In what remained of Russia's military hierarchy, A colonel named Yuri Novikov led a trek across a blighted Urals to a bunker that supposedly held survivors. They found it, full of bones, died from starvation, scratched prayers into walls. Meanwhile, in the remnants of New York's upstate, a former senator named Charles Granger gathered refugees into what he called the Civic Shield. They built fires inside school gyms, drank melted snow laced with ash, and prayed to power up an old military radio that never worked. Starvation took children first. Madness came second. And then came the snow, the red snow. It fell in Iceland, soaked with metallic ash. It melted human skin. In Tokyo, a lone pianist played to an empty hall while the ceiling buckled under atomic weight. In Nairobi, where the fallout was slower, poets gathered on rooftops and read out loud, even as winds painted the sky the color of blood. Somewhere, in what used to be Brazil, a man carved the word "why" into concrete with a butter knife. No one answered. 32 years later, a satellite launched by the Scandinavian Alliance, built from the ruins of Denmark, Sweden, and Norway, intercepted a shortwave distress signal. Origin: somewhere beneath the ruins of St. Augustine, Florida. A small shelter. 3 people. The last was a woman named Ruth Callahan. She was 15 when the war began. She had been holding her baby brother in the hallway when the fire came through the roof. She never let go. When rescuers arrived, they found notebooks filled with hundreds of letters she had written but never sent. Letters to her brother, who died before he learned to speak. Letters to Kennedy, to Khrushchev, to God. One read, "You were men with voices, and the world listened. But you shouted so loud, we all stopped breathing." Another, near the end, "If someone finds this, please tell the children of tomorrow, we did not die from war. We died from pride." Ruth died 11 hours after rescue. Her face, still turned toward the sun lamp she powered with her own tears and cranked wires. The letters are now preserved in a glass vault in Geneva, beneath layers of soil, quartz, and memory. And every October 28th, a siren sounds, not as a warning, as an apology,